Welcome back to Voluntaryist Academy. Voluntaryist Academy is an educational platform dedicated to the principles of non-aggression, self-ownership, and the ethical philosophy of voluntarism. Here, we reject the mythology of political authority and embrace the timeless truth that all human interaction should be grounded in consent and moral integrity. Through rigorous study, in-depth courses, and accessible materials, Voluntaryist Academy equips individuals with the tools to critically examine the foundations of coercive systems and to replace them with voluntary, peaceful alternatives rooted in natural law. Whether you are new to these ideas or looking to deepen your understanding, Voluntaryist Academy provides a structured path to intellectual freedom, ethical consistency, and personal sovereignty. I'd like to give you all a special warm welcome. I encourage you to explore the curriculum. I encourage you to challenge false assumptions. I encourage you to learn to live free. I am James Cordiner. I'm the host and, dare I say, professor of Voluntaryist Academy. And tonight, I am going to be continuing with the reading of Men Against the State. It'll be Benjamin R. Tucker and the Age of Liberty, Part 2. We might finish up tonight. We might not. That's kind of a mystery to me at the moment. But we're going to try to get through as much as possible with trying to avoid a super long stream. But before that can happen, I want to just take care of a little bit of the housekeeping. People over on my RSS feed, listening on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and everything, I'd like to remind you all that the live streams happen on Saturday nights weekly, as often as I can. Come over to Facebook and follow Voluntaryist Academy, the page on Facebook, to keep up with the live streams over on YouTube at the Voluntaryist Academy YouTube channel. I appreciate your listenership on the podcast RSS feed side of things. But if you want to catch the live stream, come over to this side. Then if you'd like to contribute and be a sponsor of the show, you can click the link in the description and you can become a sponsor. $3 a month for the first handful of people, few handfuls of people that sign up. After that, it's the price goes up a little bit. It's up to you which tier you want to be a part of. I mean, $3 a month is less than the price of coffee that some people pay for every single day. So it's a pretty good deal, one of the best deals on the internet. And what you get is I'm trying to build like a vibrant community of like-minded people that want to discuss better ways to bring the ideas into the real world. And I want to keep it grounded in the material that's covered in the show. I want to keep the community grounded in the philosophy of voluntarism and the different things that people are doing to kind of further along the goal of absolute freedom. And so if you want to be a part of that, sign up and you get other things as far as I can tell. There's going to be the opportunity to make live calls into the show for members and a bi-weekly town hall where we can all gather around and kind of mingle and get to know each other and, make the community a nice place to be. So yeah, that's the opportunity that we have over there. And then after that, I think this week I'm going to be publishing, look out for an interview that I'm going to be publishing. And I did an interview with Sean McCann from Wake the Dead. And we're going to be publishing that interview pretty soon. And then I think that might be it. That might be it for housekeeping. I always feel like I'm forgetting something. But I think we can just press forward and start doing the reading for tonight. Drop a comment in the chat. Give the video a thumbs up. Thanks for watching if you're watching on the replay. And share it around. That's the easiest way. If you don't want to support the channel by becoming a sponsor, you can give the channel a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and that tells the YouTube overlords that people are liking my stuff, and it puts it in front of more people. The message is important, not the messenger. So yeah, if you appreciate the message of voluntarism and what I'm bringing to the table, I think more people should be listening. So let's make that happen. Okay, so this is chapter 9 of Men Against the State. Hold on. Men Against the State by James J. Martin. Okay, let's see if that might be better. So this is the book. This is the copy that I have. You can get it for like pretty cheap. And we've been reading it. So this is part 10, chapter 9, Benjamin R. Tucker and the Age of Liberty, part 2, section 4. Section 4, Victor S. Yaros delineates the Spencerian influence. The writings of Herbert Spencer began to acquire the pliability of the scriptures during the last 2 decades of the 19th century United States, in that their scope afforded the opportunity for diverse elements to dip in, extract, and manipulate for various purposes portions which might buttress some particular stand. For instance, the exponents of laissez-faire found therein the sanction for the maintenance of the economic and social status quo. At the same time, they found comfort and support for even greater expansion of monopoly enterprise in their Darwinistic content, which seemed to justify all this as part of a program of cosmic evolution of civilization. The American anarchists, on the other hand, hardly the friends of monopoly interests, appropriated those arguments of Spencer which appeared to substantiate their attack upon the state, the earlier output of the English sociologist, furnishing especially welcome ammunition. Spencer's name acquired status among the anarchists for other reasons than as a champion of freedom and attacker of government. The ethical concept of equal rights and the evolutionary approach to societal growth were both incorporated within the structure of anarchist propaganda as the corollaries of to the Warrenite individual sovereignty principle and the anarchist concept of cultural change. No blanket acceptance of Spencer was implied by favorable mention when they found his idea compatible. Some of his views indeed received stringent treatment at their hands. Only a portion of the anarchist ranks accepted him in any capacity, and a swinging away from him as a potential prophet took place eventually when the man and his work began to be studied as a whole. Of a number who spread Spencerian doctrines among the group of anti-statist intellectuals and evaluated Spencer's contributions to the ethical and sociological side of anarchism, Victor S. Yaros was undoubtedly the most prominent. Like Tucker, Yaros had a background of participation in radical activities. As a native of the Ukraine, he had left home and come to the United States to escape arrest as one of the social revolutionaries. His first associations in America were naturally with the communist anarchists, whose objective, quote unquote, socialism without a state, he firmly supported, and to whose publications he first contributed while hardly 20 years of age. While a resident of New Haven, Connecticut during the mid-80s, that's the 1880s, his association with a group of workers who sponsored speakers of various persuasions brought him into contact with the individualists of the anarchist camp, with state socialists, and with Marxians. Here also he made his first contacts with Spencer's thought through lecture appearances of William Graham Sumner of the Yale University faculty. Late in 1885, Yaros began to write for Liberty, and his long association with Tucker, which at times practically amounted to a partnership, now began. Of all the writers whose works appeared in this paper, none exceeded the former in influence. Indeed, at times, Liberty hardly amounted to more than a two-man journal. Yaros derived intellectual stimulation from a variety of sources. The anarchist dissertations of such speakers as Henry Appleton and Dyer D. Lum, the writings of Tucker, John F. Kelly, and John William Lloyd, and the individualism of Max Steiner, through such American exponents of philosophy as James L. Walker and John Beverly Robinson. He contributed a number of reports to Liberty, along with polemics aimed at Johann Most and the socialists Edward Aveling and Liebknecht, following the American tour of the latter two in 1886. Early in the next year, Yaros began his career as an original contributor to the Anarchist Journal and regularly supplied work of considerable quality thereafter. Yaros's main concern centered around the adaptation to the anarchist philosophy of such support as could be gleaned from Darwin and Spencer and the general idea of social evolution. Thus, solution of social problems and anti-statism and rejection of socialism, political action, and legislation, as appeared in the writings of Yaros, were founded on studies of Spencer to a great extent. A third element, the subscription to the equal rights doctrine as taught by Spencer, found Yaros in agreement after a period of attachment to the opposite approach of Steiner and the concept of existence of rights as a result of voluntary contact alone. Yaros did reject Spencer's originalism theory. Organismal. That's a new one. Organismal theory of the nature of society, and eventually gave up most of his sociology as well, evincing more concern over the latter's political ideas and anti-statist leanings as expressed in portions of the original edition of Social Statics. Whatever he may have declared at a later time, Yaros was convinced, while associated with Tucker and Liberty, that anarchism was not a variety of utopianism. He disagreed entirely with sociological interpretations of anarchism as the logical conclusion of democracy or the perfection of the latter. This view, he observed, resulted in using anarchism as quote, a synonym for a millennial condition, end quote, and had no relation to the anarchism toward which he and the Tucker group worked, which was, quote, the reign of simple justice and equity, end quote, a logical outcome in the law of true society, equal liberty. Explained Yaros, the anarchists, as anarchists, work directly, not for a perfect social state, but for a perfect political system. A perfect social state is a state totally free from sin or crime or folly. A perfect political system is merely a system in which justice is observed, in which nothing is punished but crime, and nobody coerced but invaders. So this is pretty important to be able to digest, because it's addressing the utopian argument. Of course, we, in the modern times, we face this argument all the time, that anarchists are just describing a utopia. And this does a decent enough job for its time at describing what the heck is actually going on there. Every variety of collectivist solution fell under Yaros's particular criticism during the period of his greatest activity as a contributor to Liberty. Quote, freedom in sociological experiment, end quote, was the important concept which planners of quote unquote uniform regulation failed to comprehend, and was the principal road to any type of healthy social organization. Quote, anarchism will supersede authoritarian views of life in the same way that dogmas of special creation have been superseded by the doctrine of evolution, end quote. Thus, Marxist and Bellemite, quick break. Greetings, Evolving Seeds. Glad to see you in the chat. Okay, so, thus Marxist and Bellamyite socialists drew a large measure of calculated abuse from the new champion of individual freedom lately drawn from the collectivist camp. He rebuked the latter for saying that anarchists desired a state of no law by demanding that they examine more carefully the true contention, the opposition to government as a synonym for a quote-unquote compulsory protection. Quote, protection and taxation without consent is itself invasion. Anarchism favors a system of voluntary taxation and protection. End quote. Bellamy's ideal of a planned society received a severe assault, and Yaros dismissed Looking Backward as a ridiculously overrated production. The great need was freedom, not system building, said Yaros. Once this had been realized, then the course of action was to let human institutions develop the way they would. This remained part of his philosophy of society even after he had definitely given up hope in the program of the individualist anarchist group at the conclusion of the First World War. Even then, he persisted in attempting to convince socialist critics of capitalism that privilege and monopoly were not the result of freedom and competition, that these concepts were not related, and that it was misleading to describe them in cause-effect relationships. To one Marxian concept in particular, he had a fundamental objection: the historical necessity theory of revolutionary character of the industrial worker, agreeing that changes in social organization would or could be affected by a minority. His lack of faith in the soundness of Marxian revolutionary propositions was pronounced. Increasingly oppressive conditions bred as much callousness, stupidity, and quote-unquote savage selfishness as revolt or criticism, while he noticed in his own time, in the summer of 1890, a noticeable lack among the working class both of inflammable material and skilled conspirators. It was not a matter of doubting the good faith It was not a matter of doubting the good faith of socialists or in desiring to impose a new order which would guarantee the freedom of the individual. Adhering to the conviction of the anarchists that the utility of any kind of progressive measure first had to be demonstrated rather than forced upon people, it was in reality the necessity of establishing freedom first in order to allow growth of a new economic order. Nor was it a... Hold on one second. Okay, sorry, back. My executive producer here, aka my oldest child, needed to get a snack, so I wanted to mute it so he could rip open his package of crackers. Where were we? Okay, see what happens when we have to stop? It's okay. It's fine. No one can see you. All right, we were talking about skilled conspirators. It was not a matter of doubting the good faith of the socialist in desiring to impose a new order which would guarantee the freedom of the individual. Adhering to the conviction of the anarchists that the utility of any kind of progressive measure first had to be demonstrated rather than forced upon people, it was in reality the necessity of establishing freedom first in order to allow the growth of a new economic order. Brief aside. Establishing freedom, I don't know. dare I say, may be easy. Attaining it might be the easy part. Maintaining and retaining freedom, that's when things become a little more difficult. I am a proponent of objective morality and natural law, recognizing these principles and using your free will to say, no, I'm not going to initiate violence against my fellow person, and living in peace as a result. That's how we maintain and retain actual freedom. And, you know, I'm willing to argue about that, but we're not arguing tonight. We're reading tonight. The new economic order, nor was it a question of abstract right or wrong, which both minorities and majorities injected into the contest for political power. The same principle operated whether the majority tyrannized the minority or society crushed the individual. Both were engaged in a contest, attempting to enforce their own concept of right. It was Yaros's belief that the anarchists raised a third issue in the struggle between government and freedom: the gradual elimination of government from the spheres of social life. In two extended series of articles under the general headings of quote-unquote individualism and political economy and quote-unquote unscientific socialism, he presented his most able critique of the several quote schools of state socialism, end quote, and a restatement of anarchist faith in evolution toward a stateless order. Liberty both as a means both as means and end of all reform, and rejection of violence and revolution. Yaros interpreted the phenomenon of vice as the result rather than the cause of poverty and ignorance, and laid the blame for the existence of poverty to, quote, the monopoly of land, money, and trade, end quote. It was his conviction that the defenders of rent and interest taking had yet to show that such was just, as well as to disprove the contention of the radicals that profits would gradually be done away with through the operation of free competition. In fact, it was the attempt to meet the economic arguments of the anarchists and socialists, which was driving political economists into supporting state regulation. Yet he had little respect for economists, whom he described as, quote, a mutual admiration society, end quote, singularly successful in, quote, maintaining a characteristic vagueness about their creeds, end quote. In this respect, he shared Tucker's suspicion of the academic mind, which he displayed in his disparagement of such exponents of the new sociology as Lester Ward and Albion W. Small. The former's prestige he thought primarily due to log rolling on the part of fellow academic sociologists, although appreciating his estimate of the state as the bulwark of laissez-faire vested interests. There was no doubt in Yaros's mind from an examination of his writing in Liberty that Spencer had made the most important contributions to the philosophy of freedom of the individual from the state. At one time in 1889, he proclaimed, quote, more than any sociological author are the anarchists indebted to Herbert Spencer for the scientific and philosophical argumentation which supports their position, end quote. Another brief aside that we're not going to find in this book, we're not going to find any mention of Auburn Herbert and Auburn Herbert's voluntarist creed directly mentions Herbert Spencer, and I just wanted to put that out there. So while I'm taking a break from the reading Evolving Seeds, I would love to find out more about your mathematical equation that proves anarchy. That would be great. If anyone out there wants to know more about Auburn Herbert, before we continue with the reading, best place to start is the reading of his A Plea for Voluntaryism that I did. It's on the channel. It was recorded almost a year ago, and it's really some of the best. Auburn Herbert is probably he's probably the guy that coined the term voluntarism. Some of the earliest known use of the word has been in his writing. So, yeah, it's pretty cool. Herbert Spencer, Auburn Herbert. Auburn Herbert's a pretty cool dude. So, no secret was made of the fact that Spencer was the source of most of his theorizing. Quote, nobody has a better stated and elucidated the real relations of a social organizations to individual organisms, end quote. He acknowledged on still another occasion, it was no wonder that he found it disquieting to be forced to make repeated admissions of Spencerian aberrations after such glowing dedications. The rejection of Sumner had already begun. Yaros no longer spoke of him with respect, but as a, quote, half-hearted friend of liberty, end quote, who dodged fundamental issues, resulting in the increased belief by reformers that the remedy lay in state regulation and intervention. His remarks on anarchism, Yaros now considered trite and false, showing unacquaintance with radical literature of this group. In actuality, Yaros now proclaimed Sumner was a middle-class philosopher, not interested in fighting the monopolies and encroachments perpetuated by a minority under the protection of the state. The rejection of Spencer came in the spring of 1890 and grew out of his reading of the former's absolute political ethics, in which much of what he had declared in Man versus the State was disregarded. You can see the critical articles published in Liberty, Volume 6, on March 8th of 1890. So it is interesting to note the fluctuation in Yaros's estimations of Spencer during 1889 through 1892. 1889 through 1892, excuse me. Chronological comparison indicates no definite stand during the earlier part of this period, but a decidedly critical trend starts in the later part of 1891. Particularly damaging to the anarchists was the Spencerian support of the majority coercion of non-aggressive minorities within a nation on the basis that there existed a scientific warrant for such procedure. Yaros repudiated this completely, as well as the tacit approval of land monopoly, one of Spencer's most vehement condemnations at an earlier time. Yaros now began to recommend the reading of Spencer by anarchists in order that they might be able to discover for themselves the difference between Spencerian individualism and the basic philosophy of individualist anarchism. Associated with this was the growth of various liberty and property defense leagues, quote, striving to maintain their privileges and monopolies, end quote, said Yaros, which adopted Spencer as their intellectual guidepost. These were evidence enough to the anti-statist people that there was now a wide gulf between the two groups who found in the writings of Spencer support for differing social outlooks. Specifically objectionable were the singling out of factory acts and poor laws for assault while ignoring the sins of omission of the legislative process. Another objection was the attack on the trade union movement due to its growing aggressiveness, which Yaros defended. Yaros said, having to fight organized, state-supported monopolies, finding themselves reduced to the necessity of accepting inequitable terms through prior violations of equal freedom on the part of the governing power, they cannot always exercise sufficient self-restraint to keep within the bounds of legitimate resistance. Instead of indulging in futile denunciations, we ought to labor to remove the factors which render legitimate resistance on the part of trades unions more and more ineffectual and unsuccessful. Unlike Yaros, Tucker had little interest in the sociology of others and remained content to allow the former to take initiative in such speculations. It is probable that the only one of Spencer's works which really pleased Tucker was the chapter from Social Statics titled, quote, "The Right to Ignore the State," end quote, which he considered unanswerable. On the unfavorable side, he had begun to criticize the intent of Spencer's attacks on socialism as early as 1884, nearly a year and a half before Yaros became known in Liberty. The occasion was the publication by Spencer in the Popular Science Monthly and the Contemporary Review of the quote-unquote coming slavery, and similar essays, the good faith of which was seriously doubted. Commented Tucker, "He is making a wholesale onslaught on socialism as the incarnation of the doctrine of state omnipotence carried to its higher power, and I am not sure he is quite honest in this. I begin to be a little suspicious of him. It seems as if he had forgotten the teachings of his earlier writings and had become a champion of the capitalistic class. Amid his multitudinous multitudinous, I don't know that word either. This is weird. Not that weird. Multitudinous, I don't know. Sure, we'll go with that. Multitudinous illustrations of what? Yeah, multitudinous. That's not the word. Anyways, of the evils of legislation, he, in every instance, cites some law passed, ostensibly at least to protect labor, alleviating suffering, or promote the people's welfare. But never once does he call attention to the far more deadly and deep-seated evils growing out of the innumerable laws creating privilege and sustaining monopoly. I mean, I'm no socialist, folks, but you got to admit that there's like over the last 100 years, some of these companies out there, these monopolies out there, they've gotten way too powerful, and they need, their lobbying power and everything that they are able to do and fund and all this stuff that they like. Look at what they're doing now with the surveillance state and it's just not, it's not good. So it's not about like, see, I am of the opinion that capitalism has evolved, and free market capitalism is capitalism in its most moral and true form. And so when we're talking about capitalism, then we got to at least shed some light on the difference between like state capitalism and free market capitalism, where, if we're going to do free market capitalism, then at least it's kind of governed by morality. I know, she's right there. I know. All right, so let's continue here. So thus Tucker occupied himself attempting to differentiate between the passive state advocate by Spencer's conservative followers from the voluntary defensive alliance, which the anarchists designated as the limit of government. He disclaimed association with the group who sought to confine the functions of the state to the protection of quote-unquote life and property. The latter word Tucker particularly disliked, believing it to be a mere euphemism for previously acquired monopolies and advantages when used by conservatives. Anarchists, far from wishing any part of such a situation, sought instead the dissolution of the state into its component individualities, and a subsequent regrouping into any pattern the people might desire without infringement on the basic principle of individual liberty. This, said Tucker, hardly was synonymous with the Spencerian viewpoint. The The growing conviction that Spencer was no longer worthy of being regarded as an influential intellectual support was confirmed by his repudiation in 1892 of both his former anti-state writing and Proudhon, who had by now acquired the status of a giant in the field of anarchist literature. Henceforth, Tucker included Spencer among those exposed to his barbs, which number gradually included articulate Spencerians of several types. Some while later, Tucker's more considered judgment of him was somewhat kinder. Quote, anarchists recognize in Herbert Spencer a kindred spirit and offer to his memory their tribute of admiration and gratitude, end quote. Even though they could not, he said, quote, accept him as a trustworthy exponent of their political philosophy. But in the meantime, Liberty had become a radical journal of international repute, with contributors from every section of the United States as well as from most of the countries in Western Europe. In addition, a philosophical crisis has been precipitated as a result of the influence of the revived interest in Max Steiner, from whom the individualists derived the principles of an altogether different basis of social conduct. A study of the many personalities attracted to Tucker's paper during its nearly 30 years of existence. In the issues they found necessary to dissect during the time is one of the neglected episodes of American radical history at the close of the century. Okay, so before we start number 5 here, part 5. Okay, evolving seeds. Equation is R times B equals N. Right, so rights multiplied by beings equals number of beings with a right in question. And he says, what's 8 billion times 0? You know what 8 billion times 0 is? It's 0. Anything times 0 is 0. So, yeah. That's interesting. Hold on. My 9-year-old son would like everybody to know that because government has no real competition, it's difficult to get rid of them. Is that accurate? Yes. That's what you think? Yep. Okay. What if I told you that the government's competition is still with us, the people, and whether or not we accept them? What if the real competition that government has is the process of convincing people that their authority is legitimate?
Well, government is in our minds, so.
What?
Well, government is in our minds, so everybody thinks that government is a thing or person.
Yeah.
So, but it's actually in our head.
Government's in our head?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It only exists because people believe in it. So, but who convinced the people to believe in government? Well, wouldn't it serve their interest to convince people to believe in them? So maybe it was the government that maybe it was the people that wanted power that discovered a way to convince people to give it to them. So that's the competition. Government's competition is with people's critical thought, people's ability to think critically. And if people can think critically, then perhaps they don't accept the things the government does because they realize the government is being illogical and controlling, and that they don't have the right to coerce people and to steal from people and to threaten people with violence if they say no. So their competition is people's brains. That's why they have to convince people about their power. Does that make sense? Okay, so everyone listening to this, guess what? A 9-year-old can learn this. That's why I say all the time. It's just as easy to teach people. It's just as easy to teach people about voluntarism at an early age as it is to teach them about statism. So you either want to inculcate obedience to the state, or you want to, guide an individual into their own power so they can write their own script in life. That's their birthright. Freedom is our birthright. We're entitled to it because we exist. It's not a privilege. It's not something you earn. It's something that you have right from the rip. And 9-year-olds can understand that the power vested in government is only there because government has convinced people into letting them have it. Wow. Imagine that. So this is Tucker and the Age of Liberty, Part 2, Section 5. Steinerism, Max Stirner. I don't even know. I've heard it pronounced both ways.
Oh my, yeah, seriously. I can't even name some of them.
Stirnerism and the Tucker Associates. And we'll probably wrap up with this, to be honest. We'll do a part 11 next week and just get it. That way we don't have to stay up all night. We're almost an hour in already. Time flies.
Yeah.
If a 9-year-old can learn this, you can too. Anyways. Number 5, part 5, Stirnerism and the Tucker Associates. One of the popular designations which the individualist anarchist group acquired during the 1880s, was the identification Boston Anarchists. Wow. Although any other term could hardly have been less exact. Less than a quarter of the prominent contributors to Liberty during its entire history weren't even from New England, let alone residents of the Massachusetts city. The East and Midwest were well represented, and writings of residents in Florida, Texas, California, and Oregon found their way before the audience of sympathizers to anarchist philosophy. Missouri, Kansas, and Iowa developed centers of anarchist literature of their own, which had surprising circulation. However, their story is a part of the influence of Liberty and the inspirational stimulus of Tucker. In the main, the important contributors to Liberty became associated primarily during the first 10 years, even though there were a few notable adherents thereafter. The majority of these came in at three different occasions. Three different periods, 1883 to 1884, 1886 to 1887, 1891 through 1892. And did not represent any degree of like-mindedness. In fact, the reason for the appearance of so much articulate radical talent was not an effort to establish a common front against conservatism, but more the result of serious doctrinal disputes among themselves. The latter two dates especially were incidents of notable bitterness and were accompanied by defections of prominent former collaborators from the Tuckerite wing. A survey of gradual acquisition of Liberty's impressive literate talent makes the development of the split somewhat more comprehensible. Liberty, during its first 3 years, was primarily the personal organ of Tucker. Such pioneers as Engels, that's J.K. Engels, and Spooner, Lysander Spooner, were among the contributors, as well as Sidney H. Morse, an old friend of Warren and staunch supporter of the labor exchange. Even Ezra Haywood and Andrews, no longer plumb-liners, and interested in reforms of their own, drew some space, although mostly on the derogatory side. All of those people that were just mentioned, except for one, we've done some deep dives into their life in this Men Against the State series. Go back to The earlier parts, Josiah Warren, J.K. Ingalls, Stephen Pearl Andrews, Lysander Spooner, all these fellas have all been featured in this series. It could be seen quite plainly, however, that the rise of Tucker to prominence as the chief among the intellectual anarchist pamphleteers was the signal for the parallel rise of a new generation of adherents to the cause. The majority of the writers of this group were journalists, as was Tucker himself. Trained to write and generally prevented by the nature or circumstances of their employment from expressing their anti-state convictions and beliefs, they brought to Tucker's paper a quality of radical writing unsurpassed in its own time and rarely approached since. Of the early number, besides Yaros, the most prominent were Joseph A. Labadie, Allen and John F. Kelly, Henry Appleton, Edwin C. Walker, Florence Finch, J.H. Swain, M.E. Lazarus, and James L. Walker. The years 1885 to 1886 saw new entrants, notably John William Lloyd, Gertrude B. Kelly, Dyer D. Lum, and Alfred B. Westrip. It was this group of enthusiasts, several of whom wrote under pseudonyms, that produced the controversial material which made Liberty an absorbing paper even to conservative readers. It was also almost among these that the strains developed, resulting in the first split in the individualist front in 1887. A brief account of the diversity of their backgrounds and contributions illustrate this point. Alan Kelly, also a Boston newspaperman, became Tucker's first editorial associate, remaining in that capacity until May of 1888. A bitter critic of the railroads, most of his better articles were aimed at railroad monopolies, which threatened to become the American monarchy, and which had already, quote, disinherited the people from an area of land 33 times the size of New Hampshire, end quote. Labadie followed the first of the three Kellys to write for Liberty, a Detroit printer and writer for a number of socialist and labor papers, including Haskell's Truth and the Detroit papers Today and the Advance and Labor Leaf. Among others, his relations with other portions of the radical and reform movement remained partially intact during his participation in Tucker's literary experiment. A contributor as early as June 1883, he still remained as secretary of the National Board of Supervision of the Socialist Labor Party a year later. During this period, he gradually lost faith in reconciliation between the various fragments of the socialist movement, but retained a strong interest in the fortunes of the labor movement. In this, however, he gradually became the exponent of anarchist measures and argued the anti-statist case with their leaders and before their conventions when he attended. Most of Labadie's ideas in Liberty were presented through the medium of a column called Cranky Notions. In agreement with Tucker on most points, he still clung to the belief that the labor movement could produce benefits, primarily in obtaining reductions in the hourly hours worked, with neither raises nor reductions in pay. Admitting his loss of faith in socialism during the fall of 1888, he still considered it expedient for the government to control natural monopolies such as waterworks, streets, and railroads. But he thought that schools, banks, post offices, and like institutions would be best left to operate in the operation by individuals. Like Tucker, he backed the assertion that the best way to prevent monopolies would be to withhold the grant of franchises. Politically, Labadie inclined to a policy of compromise also, in the hope of extracting some gain from a situation which he bound to remain deadlocked as the result of instance upon total realization of ideas. Unimpressed with voting as utilized under universal suffrage, which he described as, quote, a process by which truth is established by numbers, end quote, he considered that anarchists might use it to advance the principles of liberty. He said, all political questions mean either more or less government. Labadie said. In defending he said this in defending the participation of anarchists in voting in order to forestall more positive legislation. Nationally, he was shocked by the Republican program, which he said was that of, quote, establishing a nation with a big N and crushing out local autonomies. Under their sponsorship, he saw the realization of Hamiltonian authoritarianism in its greatest severity, and for this reason inclined to favor Democrats, whom he saw as still opposed to the centralization of power. Throughout his gradual swing to anarchism, Labadie retained friendly relations with the Knights of Labor and other working men's organizations. It was his belief that his persistence was responsible for weakening the faith of some of Detroit's most active and intelligent labor leaders in the principle of government control. It was not necessary to, quote, desert one's area of agitation, end quote, on becoming an anarchist, Labadie held, and under this impression remained one of Tucker's closest associates, as a relationship which even the end of liberty did not terminate. From the point of view of intellect, the outstanding member of the first group of Liberty writers was Henry Appleton, a graduate of Brown University and a Providence, Rhode Island newspaperman. He had become acquainted with anarchism of the native, small n, brand at about the same time as Tucker. Appleton developed a reputation for brilliance both as a writer and speaker within the radical movement, contributing to Hayward's Word, the Index, and the Irish World, besides the Tucker Journal, under pseudonyms in both the latter. Anarchism as expounded in Liberty, said Appleton, was the philosophical basis of a method in sociology, and fully as deserving of consideration as any other. In another sense, it was not a mere theory, but the direct and logical outcome of the progressive movement to simplify and popularize government. Neither was it an institution, but in actuality the sworn enemy of all institutions, with a mission to disintegrate them whenever found. Since liberty was the life principle of anarchism, and every institution denied liberty, then anarchism and institutions were opposites by nature. Only in liberty was it possible for the anarchist to find order. And from this state of liberty stemmed consent, quote, the pivotal basis of all arrangements worthy of the name government, end quote. Appleton did not agree with Tucker unreservedly. The two matched arguments and opinions many times before the final break took place in 1887. The very definition of the word anarchy was a matter of contention between them. Appleton held that the word meant opposition to the archos, or political leader, while Tucker averred that it had a much broader connotation. Opposition to the arche, variously interpreted as beginning and origin, and which extended to cover first principle, supreme power, and governmental office. This, said Tucker, was the correct definition of anarchy with relation to its Greek root. In his approach to both the state and the church, Appleton differed from Tucker also.
He held that the separation of the two had never taken place, and that such devices as authority, majority rule, and popular suffrage made the maintenance of the church a vital part of the maintenance of the state. Nor did he find the state as a political structure the reason for as much evil as Tucker. The fault lay in the individuals who had no desire to exercise freedom. Tucker said, "As an individualist, I find the political state a consequent rather than an antecedent. The state is a variable quantity, expanding just in proportion as previous surrenders of individual sovereignty give it material. The initial cause is, however, the surrendering individual, the state being possible only after the surrender. Hence, the individual is the proper objective point of reform. As he is reformed, the state disappears of itself." The condition which facilitated the default on the part of the individual of his precious sovereignty, Appleton went on, was not arbitrary tyranny, but, quote, "that diseased condition known as centralization," end quote. The breaking up of the large cities and the localization of the population upon the land in smaller communities would destroy the state. But hope of such action on the part of the urban individual was futile. Labor meetings resounded with the cry, quote, "the land belongs to the people," end quote. He observed, but not even whipping would drive people from the cities to enjoy what they allegedly wanted. Hence his stress upon individual conversion, which Tucker dismissed as a worthy endeavor. In line with such sentiments of Appleton's was his detestation for the expression "the masses," quote, "a term having no scientific value and utterly meaningless in sociology," end quote. Reform could not come only through the actions of individuals. From this aversion for, quote unquote, dragging along the masses in bulk, end quote, came his blow at labor organization along political lines for the purposes of supplying a counterforce to that of monopoly capital. It was not the laboring man's fault, for he had been taught that force was a valid moral principle. However, the recourse to force to solve all crises would surely accelerate social chaos. Appleton said, "I say to labor, organize, but with your backs toward the ballot boxes, for all seeming emancipation through politics is illusory and costs far more than it is worth." Not all of those attracted by Tucker's paper were urban radicals under the influence of conditions produced by industrial living. Three of the most articulate were agrarians: Lloyd, Lazarus, and E.C. Walker. And their ideas of social organization were closest to those long proclaimed by Warren. Lloyd, although a native of New Jersey, wrote from Granville, Florida, when first connected with liberty, while Lazarus, a veteran of 30 years pamphleteering in radical economic causes, operated a small farm in Guntersville in upcountry Alabama. Walker's first association with the radical movement was an outgrowth of his relation through marriage to Moses Harmon, the publisher of a vigorous women's rights press in Valley Falls, Kansas. His paper, Lucifer, the Light Bearer, grew to be somewhat anarchist in its viewpoint as Walker assumed a larger part in its publication. And much material of importance to the individualist propaganda first appeared under its imprint. Lucifer, the Light Bearer, grew out of the Valley Falls Liberal, a free thought paper begun in 1880. Tucker and some of his group did not care for Lucifer at a later time because of its stress upon sexual relations, and grew to find fault with Walker for his gradual swing toward Harmon's point of view, which was somewhat increased due to his marriage to Harmon's daughter. During its early years, however, Lucifer was forthright anti-statist in its views. Later anarchists and socialists esteemed Harmon to a far greater degree. See, for instance, the congratulatory letters from Eugene Debs, Alexander Berkman, Emma Goldman, and Carl Nold as, quote, the Nestor of free expression, end quote, and for his, quote unquote, noble life work in Lucifer, April 25th, 1907, page 71, September 27th of 1906, page 590. The paper carried no volume numbers at this time. For Walker, as a forerunner of the egoist philosophy, see his A Plea for Materialism in Index 8, in The Index, Volume 8, published December 13th, 1877, page 596. Tucker regarded Walker highly and referred to him as a radical of rare consistency who was engaged in a significant effort toward liberalizing the West. From this trio, and principally Walker, came the last impetus toward colonizing on the original small basis. Quote, a practical application of the principles of anarchy that shall challenge the attention of the slothful masses. End quote. Small groups acting upon the principles of voluntary mutualism were necessary, said Walker, if only for the reason that such colonies preserved the radicals, who under ordinary circumstances were quickly coerced into exhibiting conventional behavior and subscribing to conventional attitudes. Lazarus championed the social value of work close to the soil, the avoiding of taxed goods as much as possible, and the creation of a self-supporting economy in such small communities on an industrial as well as an agricultural level. A fundamental difference between Walker and Tucker as to the future of the city in America underlay their debate. The former believed that it was doomed, but Tucker was convinced that it was destined to become the permanent center of distribution in American civilization, not only of material wealth, but of nearly everything else. Yeah, the center of distribution, huh? Granting that Walker's arguments in favor of communities were forcible and weighty, Tucker called his program social landscape gardening. The objective of preventing the continual raids and drains upon the radical element was indeed worthy. Yet the results of such settling to him appeared bound to experience failure in one way or another. Reformed communities will either be recruited from the salt of the earth, and then, so Tucker said, the reformed communities will either be recruited from the salt of the earth, and then their successes will not be taken as conclusive because it will be said that their principles are applicable only among men and women well nigh perfect, or with these elect will be a large admixture of semi-lunatics among them. Semi-lunatics among them. Society will be unendurable and practical work impossible. It has no interest for me now. I care nothing for any reform that cannot be effected right here in Boston among the everyday people whom I meet in the streets. Tucker was of the opinion that colonies generally failed because of the lack of success as productive enterprises. Society at large generally solved production problems. The problem of their own times was one of distribution, the settlement of which needed only freedom in its process. For this reason, he declared his opposition to the Appleton thesis of individual improvement, despite the latter's support in disparaging the renewed interest in colonizing along anarchist lines. In fact, the assumption that the achievement of superior social conditions in the world at large attended an improvement in the character of world citizens Tucker put aside as seriously defective. Another statement of the gospel of goodness. This was not the program of individualist anarchism. Quote, the very gist of our argument and our hope is that freedom once allowed, social conditions steadily improve through the natural working of economic processes. And as a result, character improves, end quote. And that's from Liberty, Volume 9, published March 4th of 1893, page 2. Having declared a renewal of the Warrenite tactics no longer of value for their time, and the evolutionary approach of Appleton, and incidentally Yaros, as being a part of from the propaganda of anarchism, Tucker went on to attack their stand towards centralization. It was not the physical centralization that was an evil. On the whole, the people at large had greatly benefited from centralization of industry. People had benefited from the centralization of industry, trade, and settlement. It was the centralization of control of these things in the hands of a few which was creating poverty and wretchedness. The localization needed is not the localization of persons in space, but of powers in persons. That is the restriction of power to self and the abolition of power over others. Finance capitalism and pervasive nature of the state were the enemies, not evil individuals and centralization per se, said Tucker. Government makes itself felt alike in city and in country. Capital has its usurious grip on the farm as surely as on the workshop. And the oppressions and exactions of neither government nor capital can be avoided by migration. The state is the enemy, and the best means of fighting it can be found in communities already existing. In line with his diagnosis, the following remedial action was suggested: that in any given city, a sizable number of anarchists begin a parallel economy within the structure of that around them, attempting to include in their ranks representatives of all trades and professions. Here, they might carry on their production and distribution on the cost principle, basing their credit and exchange system upon a mutual bank of their own, which would issue a non-interest-bearing currency to the members of the group for the conduct of their commerce, and aid the disposal of their steadily increasing capital and beginning new enterprises. It was Tucker's belief that such a system would prosper within the shell of the old and draw increasing attention and participation from other members of the urban population, gradually turning the whole city into a, quote, great hive of anarchistic workers, end quote. Quote, it is such results that I look forward to, declared Tucker to his associates, and for the accomplishment of such that I work. It was nearly 30 years before he was to admit that the process of centralization had gone too far, especially in control over finance, for any such remedy as his to become effective even on a limited basis. Of far more interest and effect ideologically was the impact of the introduction of philosophical concepts of Max Steiner into the Tuckerite camp, principally by John L. Walker and George Shum, and later by John Beverly Robinson. Here once more we were fought out the issues which split Warren and Andrews at an earlier time, and which caused even more widespread disaffection now, as Tucker became solidly attached to Steinerism and was promptly deserted by most of his earlier literary aides. Schum, a Boston journalist, was a student of Steiner directly and was able to communicate his ideas extremely well due to his own remarkable fluency in both German and English. Walker, also a newspaperman, developed the egoistic philosophy independently and was struck by the similarity with Steiner a few years after he had begun setting down his ideas through the medium of such papers as Tucker's. Tucker immediately saw in egoism distinctly anarchist elements to which he quickly gave accord, and later acquaintances such as Robinson and John Henry Mackay, the biographer of Steiner, and an anarchist writer of considerable merit himself, strengthened him in his convictions. In some ways, his adoption of the newly discussed tenets of egoism was tied up with the understanding of individual sovereignty derived from Warren earlier. Since the latter had dismissed altruism and subscribed to enlightened self-interest as the realistic basis of human conduct, it is not surprising to find his most prominent pupil adhering to a similar philosophy when proposed under different circumstances and in a more abstract manner. Despite his primary concern with economics, Tucker found the contemplation of ethical matters intriguing. In his own way, he probed into the phenomenon of evil as it related to the philosophy of anarchism. His primary search was for an answer to the question, what is wrong? And that's supplied by J.L. Walker, but strained through his Warrenite individual sovereignty convictions, was eminently satisfactory. The reform movement, said Tucker, was on the whole a negative campaign against wrongs. Yet there appeared to be no one within their ranks capable of furnishing a satisfactory definition of the word itself. The usual basis upon which a thing received condemnation as a wrong was the fact that it usually resulted in what was judged to be injustice by some group or of individuals. Overlooked in the process was the fact that wrongs, to some, often worked to the great profit and comfort of larger groups and others, hence destroying any possible method of discovering the nature of a wrong on the sole criterion of injustice. Hence, the majority of reforms soon dissipated themselves in struggles between classes which divided along lines of favor versus unprivilege. Quote, selfishness in contact with itself, end quote. The anarchist, on the other hand, defined wrong as the result of some violation of the law of true liberty, which they further qualified as spontaneous association by natural selection. Tucker said, the basic factor of social existence is that the individual shall be left entirely and absolutely free to regulate his life as experimental contact with other equally free individuals may seem to direct. Thus, right and wrong were principles subject to constant redefinition, qualification, and circumscription by each individual behaving in his, quote-unquote, associative capacity, end quote, quote-unquote, end quote. Therefore, action taken either individually or as a result of voluntary association was qualified by the factor of direct responsibility. Quote, under this law, all individuals have a right to do anything and everything which they may choose voluntarily to do at their own cost. End quote. There was little variation from Josiah Warren in these sentiments. I think everyone knows that the key word there, voluntarily. Right? Okay. The consequence of the individual sovereignty position then left no alternative to accepting egoism in the sense of enlightened self-interest as the only motivating force in human conduct. As far as motive is concerned, altruism is out of the question, end quote, Tucker flatly stated. Furthermore, superiority came with the increased grasp of the realization, and eventually egoism and liberty became synonyms. The rejection of altruism had other consequences upon anarchists, the principal of which was the abandonment of the concept of obligation, except in the case of being something assumed under voluntary or mutual agreement. Hence the scrapping of the term duties as well as rights. What one might look upon as a right, said Tucker, in reality was a social convention. In fact, here he deviated from the path which the predecessors in the propagation of individualist anarchism had taken, and dismissed the whole concept of natural rights as a myth. We still liking Tucker here? I don't know. Maybe he turns it around. Human equality was the only thing anarchists could recognize, and since social order was the desired end, then social expediency was the standard of conduct, and its fundamental precept, quote, the greatest amount of liberty compatible with equality of liberty, end quote. How many more pages in this section here? We got like, oh man, where were we? The banishment of moral and natural rights from the ethical scene, while at the same time avowing that the stable society was the desirable objective, brought up the specter of the prevalence of might or pure force, a fact which Tucker willingly admitted. However, the subordination to the strong did nothing toward achieving this end, since the perpetual existence of insecurity undermined any gains effected through the application of mere brute strength. The alternative which anarchism proposed, said Tucker, was contract, quote, a tacit agreement or understanding between human beings as individuals living in daily contact and dependent upon some sort of cooperation with each other for the satisfaction of their daily wants, not to trespass upon each other's individuality, the motive of this agreement being the purely egoistic desire of each for the peaceful preservation of his own individuality. The great problem before those wishing a world founded upon contract and egoism, rather than one based upon natural rights and altruism, was the difficulty either in demonstrating human frailty to those willing to live by violating these agreements out of the confidence in their ability to escape retribution, or due to infractors, quote, through mistaken and superstitious ideas about religion, morality, and duty, end quote. The fight to make people see that the free life of the other made theirs that much more free, and that this was best promoted by contracts which, in one way or another, abrogated invasive powers, this, said Tucker, was worth continuing, since nothing else but the rule of force would ever exist in its stead. The concept of natural rights being lofty but meaningless in times of emergency. Tucker said, before contract is the right of might. Contract is the voluntary suspension of the right of might. The power secured by such suspension we may call the right of contract. These two rights, the right of might and the right of contract, are the only rights that ever have been or ever can be. So-called moral rights have no existence. So this is where I feel like I just want to stop. Benjamin Tucker is turning out to be a real piece of shit. Of course moral rights have existence. All rights are moral rights. Morality is right and wrong. Morality is the difference between right and wrong. Something that's moral is something that's right. So moral rights have no existence. The right of might and the right of contract are the only rights that ever have been or ever can be. That's how many more pages of this do I have to suffer through? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, almost 10. The ethical transition to intellectual philosophical egoism was now a reality, accompanied by widespread repercussions in the individualist anarchist camp. 4 prominent liberty contributors severed their connections with Tucker. Those were Appleton, Lazarus, John F., and Gertrude B. Kelly. The latter another of several talented women who took part in the movement at one time or another. The desertion of natural rights weakened Lloyd also, but Labadie subscribed to the egoist stand, as did Yaros, for a time. In spite of the fact that Spencerian and egoist philosophies occupied diametrical positions on more than one issue, Yaros was able to reconcile the two. One of the most able statements on the anti-altruist point of view was written by him at the height of the defection, at which time the bulk of the controversy was being carried on by J.L. Walker and John F. Kelly. The propaganda of egoism and the frontal attack upon altruism and natural rights in individualist circles reached a new peak of vigor in 1891, as far as liberty was concerned. Foremost among the newer writers on the subject was Robinson, an ex-single taxer, land reformer, and anarchist formerly of Tolstoyan leanings. In line with Tucker-Steiner doctrine that individual happiness was the objective of existence, Robinson concisely summarized the position as to behavior. Robinson says, "Virtue is virtue only because it is productive of happiness. Vice is vice only because it is productive of unhappiness. At the bottom, moreover, each one is unable to determine what is for the advantage of or happiness of another, while each one knows better than anyone else what is for his own happiness. Therefore, at the bottom, each action must be judged by the individual as whether it is conducive to his own happiness, not as to whether it will make somebody else happy. And this applies in its fullest force even to those actions called altruistic, which give pleasure to the doer indirectly, although directly they may give pain to the doer and pleasure to somebody else. A kind action performed without any sense of gratification to the doer loses its character as a kind action. If the one who is benefited even suspects that his benefactor is loath to do him this kind act, his appreciation of it gives place to reluctance or even to resentment. Benevolence is hypocrisy, which prompted by any feeling but personal delight in benevolence. Such most briefly and inadequately sketched in egoism. For a time, the philosophy of egoism enjoyed a wide radical audience. Others beside Tucker, interested in its propagation, entered the field of publication. A California magazine titled Egoism, published by Georgia and Henry Replogle, provided Walker with an excellent medium of expression. While John Basil Barnhill's The Eagle and the Serpent combined the ideas of Steiner, Nietzsche, and Ibsen, as well as contemporaries of lesser note in America and elsewhere. On the other hand, the intellectual partnership of Tucker and Yaros was severely strained by the innovation. Yaros finally declaring his repudiation of Steinerism and reaffirming his attachment to Spencer's stand on rights. Henceforth, liberty presented the arguments of both sides, but Steiner and egoism were definitely on the ascendancy, and remained thus throughout the existence of the periodical. No less important did Tucker consider his connection with its spread, when, with the assistance of Walker and Stephen T. Byington, He published an English translation of Steiner's Der Einzig und sein Ungten. I don't know how to. Der Einzig und sein Egunten. In 1907, he announced to his readers, "I have been engaged for more than 30 years in the propaganda of anarchism, and I have achieved some things of which I am proud, but I feel that I have done nothing for the cause that compares in value with my publication of this volume." Although the ethical content of intellectual egoism provided the controversial material among the Tuckerites, the new personalities affiliating between 1887 and 1897 were attracted far more because of discussions over economic than philosophical affairs. Land and money reformers predominant among them, and on the whole, they subscribed to Tucker's concepts of the monopoly origin of most economic distress. E.H. Simpson supported the charge that there were no natural monopolies, but that all were chartered, and gave evidence of their precarious nature by the incessant traffic between lobbies and governmental officials, attempting to forestall competitors through various types of bribery and corruption. William Hansen, next to Engels, the most competent of anarchist critics of Henry George, argued in much the same manner with respect to land. The admission that land monopoly was responsible for rent called for the logical remedy not of taxation but of repeal of the laws which created a vested interest in the soil. Hansen said, "Take away the protective power of the state, and the defenders of vested rights would no longer have the power to enforce their unrighteous claims." There were other critics of George among the newcomers, although objections tended to revolve around the issue of finance, of great concern to anarchists and generally neglected by single-tax economists. An example of this was the brilliant Indianapolis critic Herman Kuhn, himself a single-taxer when first associated with liberty, but who later became an outstanding proponent of the mutual banking idea. His principal point was the Georgian justification of interest and the failure to approach the problem of monopolized medium of exchange. Observed Kuhn, quote, "For more than 30 pages of Progress in Poverty, George writes of interest, never finding occasion to use the word credit at all." Other predominant money reformers, including Henry Cohen, William Trinkhaus, Alfred B. Westrip, and non-anarchist but sympathetic Philadelphia manufacturer Hugo Bilgrim, entered the currency controversy in exhausting detail. Westrip, adamantly influenced by Warren, Haywood, and Green, himself published a free bank paper called The Auditor in Chicago in 1891. He strongly condemned greenbackism and all other fiat money systems whose case rested on the assumption that what the government might designate to be money was money. Oh, wow. 22 years later, I mean, this is 1891. But the panic of 1907, oh my God. In Liberty, he attacked the control of the currency system by the state, especially the effects resulting from the control of its volume. He believed it impossible for the state to know how much money was needed, and hence presumptuous to arbitrarily limit it. So as much as I'm like really just aggravated with Benjamin Tucker at this point in the story, like there's something to be said here about, Hugo Bilgrim here. And Westrip here in 1891 in The Auditor. They're warning about the central banks. They're warning about it. They're warning about it right here. There weren't like this is, so not directly calling it a central bank, but government's control of currency, of money, They didn't listen. No one wanted to listen. People weren't able to listen. The news didn't travel fast enough. Cohen also wrote very effectively, being especially attached to Green's ideas. In Denver, he gradually developed a center of considerable interest in anarchist finance and brought out 2 editions of Green's Mutual Banking and several other financial tracts in a long period of radical propaganda activity. Of all the writers on money who made use of the liberty to express their varied concepts, Pilgrim obtained the most respect and attention from Tucker. In The Iron Law of Wages, he developed the main theme that could not be kept down to the cost of the main theme that wages could not be kept down to the cost of laborers' subsistence were it not for the monopoly by a privileged class of the right to represent wealth by money, thus allowing them to monopolize credit as well. His Involuntary Idleness, which Tucker called the best treatise on money and relation of money to labor written in English since Mutual Banking, reached much the same conclusions as Tucker. Financial legislation was the real seat of the prevailing social disorder, and that the only way to obtain work for everybody able and willing to work was to abolish the restrictions upon the issue of money. It was his belief, however, that the government could best run a mutual bank system, which Tucker bitterly denied. The year 1892 saw the association of 3 of Tucker's most talented compatriots, Stephen T. Byington, William Bailey, and Clarence Lee Schwartz. The Schwartz. Byington, a Vermont-born ex-single tax and reform taxer and former divinity student, was one of the intellects of the movement. A school teacher and a master of 10 languages, he entered enthusiastically into the campaign to promote the philosophy of anarchism through education. He had great hopes in getting across the idea of the boycott as a substitute for physical coercion, a policy which had long been in force at modern times, under actual living conditions. Anarchism, said Byington, has undertaken to change men's minds in one point by removing their faith in force. From his home in Ballard Vale, Massachusetts, he began directing a device previously used by Georgists, a letter-writing corps, in the spring of 1894. This was a group which voluntarily pledged itself to write 1 letter a week to any address which he as secretary might supply, designated as targets for that week, as an avowed propaganda effort to get the doctrines of the scientific anarchists before the general public, especially the daily newspaper. As a regular department in Liberty, this scheme operated for over 3 years, with Tucker's hearty approval. The letter writers were encouraged to steal ideas from back issues of the paper without fear, since none of its materials was copyrighted. The influence of this letter writing extended somewhat beyond the period of its formal sponsorship in Liberty. Bailey, a native of Manchester, England, came to the United States in 1891, settling in Boston. A Kropotkian anarchist for some time, he rapidly became a convert to the American variety, achieving prominence among them somewhat later as the biographer of Warren. It was his conviction that anarchism was a political rather than an economic doctrine, but that it involved the economic aspect of society in as fundamental a manner. Both Spencerian and Stirnerite in outlook, he sought to arrive at a body of principles on which all the individualists might agree. In an ambitious undertaking, Problems of Anarchism, which he ran through 19 lengthy installments in Liberty during the first 8 months of 1893. In an excellently written essay, the anarchist spirit, inserted as an introduction to Josiah Warren, published 13 years later. He summarized the conclusions of this investigation, as well as placing on record a 20th century definition of anarchism and his reason why it still had its place in his own time. He said, "Modern anarchism is primarily a tendency, moral, social, and intellectual. As a tendency, it questions the supremacy of the state, the infallibility of statute laws, and the divine right of all authority, spiritual or temporal. It is, in truth, a product of authority, the progeny of the state, a direct consequence of the inadequacy of law and government to fulfill their assumed functions. In short, the anarchist tendency is a necessity of progress, a protest against usurpation, privilege, and injustice." Swartz, for a time, the assistant to Harman in the publication of Lucifer, also showed interest in anarchist finance. His later What is Mutualism being a widely regarded book by fellow anti-statist interested in anarchist economics. With Lloyd and William Wallstein Gordak as collaborators, he entered into the publication of 2 periodicals during one of Liberty's several suspensions, I and The Free Comrade. Although the latter approached an eclectic character, much like that which Andrews had favored in the early 80s, was considered for a time, but this aspect of the movement was by now completely vitiated. One of the few anarchist publications in actual operation at the time of the McKinley assassination, Swartz's Free Comrade, now operated by Lloyd, deplored the act as terrible folly and declared that there is no healing for the sickness of mankind in blood. So we're talking about President McKinley being assassinated. It's said that McKinley was assassinated by a self-proclaimed anarchist. I forget the guy's name. But the long and short of it is due to the McKinley assassination, we now have the formation of Interpol. Others attempted the task assumed by Bailey in reconciling the many elements which went to make up individualist anarchism as it emerged from the combined influences of Spencerian and Sternite doctrines. One of these projected syntheses was the brief outline of Fred Schulder, called The Relation of Anarchism to Organization. Another was Francis D. Tandy, an associate of Cohen in Denver, whose modern social tendencies and voluntary socialism were anarchist works of considerable repute, showing influence of Tucker, Spencer, and Thoreau. Thoreau. Both Tandy and Schulder were recipients of Tucker's approval in their activities along the program of educational propaganda for the anarchist cause. Tucker had 4 contemporaries of considerable merit in the publication field whose major operations remained apart from his. These men, Dyer D. Loom, Charles T. Fowler, Edward H. Fulton, and Ross Wynn, backed significant periodical presses in scattered parts of the country and occasionally featured the same writers appearing in Liberty. Fowler, along with Tucker, was a former disciple of Warren in Boston during 1873 and thus received his anti-statism from the original source. Also, like Green, that's William B. Green, a dissident Unitarian preacher, he became associated with Haywood and the Word shortly thereafter, but left New England to settle in Kansas City, Missouri. From this city, he published a periodical called The Sun, a work which Tucker endorsed and sold along with his own. and which featured articles on anarchist land and money principles of considerable literary quality. Loom, one of the most interesting and important figures in the American anarchist movement, established relations with both its major wings during a hectic 10 years of association, but also remained close to the individualist philosophy. A native of Geneva, New York, he served as an officer in the Union Army during the Civil War, and after Reconstruction entered politics in Massachusetts as a candidate for lieutenant governor on the greenback ticket. His career as a participant in the labor movement grew out of his reflections on the Pittsburgh riots during the 1877 railroad strike, but before Haymarket had swung over to the extreme left position of the anarchists and mutualists, impressed with the possibilities of cooperation in economics. Following the arrest of Parsons in Chicago, Loom revived the Alarms late in 1887, changing much of its editorial policy to fit in line with that of Liberty, in which he had been writing for some time. Henceforth, he carried on in the interests of the individualists, dwelling especially on the occupation and use land tenure and the mutual bank money ideas in works of his own and in the journals of others. Along with Tucker, he expressed the conviction that force was not necessary to effect a revolution, nor was there any proof that its use was even generally successful. For this, he earned the castigation of Most, that's Johann Most, and others of the communist wing for adhering to a bourgeois scheme. Their designation for the individualist program of change through intellectual conviction, a bourgeois scheme. As a critic of George and a friend of trade unions, he added other material to the literature of the anti-statist group. That would be the Arbitrator. Actually, I'm not going to read that. I'm going to read. Never mind. Fulton, probably the most obviously influenced by Tucker of all the independents, began his paper called The Age of Thought on July 4th of 1896, at the height of a serious depression and a hectic political campaign, at a time also when liberty had begun to appear irregularly. Extremely well written, featuring his own ideas plus those of the Denver group of Tandy, Cohen, and William Holmes. Fulton's paper soon acquired a subscribers list of several thousand. Wow, that's neat. And was easily the best of the separately sponsored journals. A former advocate of colonization, he now stressed the land for use in free banking propositions and dismissed the Bryan Silver campaign as a squabble in regard to which two powerful classes shall exercise an iniquitous privilege. The position of the anarchists with relation to the restrictions of the currency to specie, whether gold, silver, or both. Fulton's activities as a radical publisher continued for several years after the World War, 5 different journals appearing under his sponsorship down to 1928. Wynne achieved attention as the outstanding anti-statist writer and publisher in the South, as well as developing a reputation for fiery and vituperative language in his publications, which was matched by, but seldom by, any of his conferers elsewhere. He edited and published several in Tennessee and Texas for nearly 15 years, and although he mustered among his contributors such men as Labadie and Charles Erskine Scott Wood, the tone of his philosophy gradually slid over to socialism. Nevertheless, he featured reprints of Kropotkin, Emma Goldman, Spooner, and Tucker, as well as maintaining relations with Francisco Ferrer and Leo Tolstoy. For the picturesque quality of his style and for his wide association with radical movement, Wynne deserves a special mention, as well as an example of Southern protest from the left. There were a number of other forceful personalities who were part of the Native Anarchist, small n, Native Anarchist movement in one or another of several capacities, such as William Wittick, Warren E. Brokaw, Thomas H. Bell, Hugh O. Pentecost, A.G. Wagner, William C. Owen, C.L. James, Charles T. Spratting, Theodore Schroeder, as well as the talented women Sarah Elizabeth Holmes, Voltairine de Cleyre, Olive Schreiner, and Miriam Daniels. Without mention of this group, the scope of the Tuckerite Association is not complete. As a whole, it was an impressive gathering of literary talent engaged for the most part in a common cause, despite a multitude of individual differences. All right, so next week we will conclude. It'll be the epic conclusion of Men Against the State by James J. Martin, and I'll get through it. And I was not expecting this part to take almost 2 hours, but it took what it took, and we got through it. So go over to voluntaristacademy.com. Go over to go over there. You know what else I should plug? The One Great Work Network, onegreatworknetwork.com. Go over there. A lot of content creators over there, and it's great. I've been on there for a few years now, and hold on, I can't get this. Yeah, I've been on the One Great Work Network for a few years now, and it's wonderful. If you don't know what that is, it's a creation of Mark Passio's. There's 70 content creators over there, and we're all talking about natural law, anarchism, freedom, all sorts of different things revolving our rights and liberty. So, I guess that's it for me tonight. Voluntaristacademy.com. Become a sponsor, support the show, give a thumbs up, give a thumbs down, share the show, leave a comment, do all that stuff. And we'll see you next week for the conclusion of this. And until then, I wish you all the best. I love you all. You own yourself, period. See you next week.